Welcome, everybody. I'm Sabri Murray. I'm a technology transfer specialist at Stellenbosch University. And with me on the webinars, Julia from the GHIAA Global Health Innovation Accelerator, Dr. Joanne van Hamelen from Adams & Adams, and Dr. Mustaqim Degama from Afrigen Biologics. I'm going to introduce Julia. We were introduced with one another through a mutual friend who also has an interest with GHIAA. And the opportunity came about was to collaborate to establish a webinar series to promote a toolkit that GHIAA has effectively developed to facilitate the access and commercialization, collaboration, and conclusion of agreements as well. So Julia can mention a bit more about that, but I'm going to hand over to her. My role here is as a panelist, but then also, I think, to an extent, an MC as well to assist with all the questions and engagements as well. So over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Samurai, and greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Samurai mentioned, last month we held a webinar in which we talked about the different types of partnerships and agreements which form the pathway from health innovation to patient access. And I think someone's going to put the link to the previous webinar in the chat for you all later, for those of you that did not have a chance to look at that. Just 2 sentences about GHIAA. We, on our Map Guide platform, we have a number of open access resources, really around how open access to medical innovation happens, how equitable access is developed in agreements, and how you might consider it from your different perspectives. So hopefully you will especially find the Equitable Access Toolkit of use and have a look at that. In the webinar last month, we talked about these different partnerships. And so when we were talking about putting together this webinar, we wanted to get people who could sort of represent different links on the chain, if you will, as you go through these different partnerships. So, of course, the parties to all these agreements often have diverse goals, and therefore agreement negotiations require partners to agree on aligned approaches. This alignment is particularly important and sometimes challenging to achieve when seeking to ensure that a healthcare innovation will be available, affordable, and accessible for all the patient populations that need it when they need it. So today we're going to hear from 3 panelists who have direct experience of building these partnerships and negotiating these agreements that aim to facilitate equitable access to healthcare innovations. I'm going to give brief introductions. The longer introductions, I think, are contained in the invitation to the webinar. So if I cut out some things that you're particularly interested in, I hope you'll go back and have a look at those. And apologies in advance to anybody whose bio I mess up here, but I'm going to try to summarize these. So Dr. Joanne van Hamelen is an equity partner and patent attorney at Adams & Adams, which is Africa's biggest IP firm. She has more than 20 years experience advising clients in biotechnology, pharmaceutical, chemical, and life science sectors. She has a PhD in medical microbiology and vaccine development, as well as prior experience in HIV vaccine development and clinical trial preparation. So she's able to assist clients in a whole range of scientific and commercial perspectives with patent filings and prosecutions, IP transactions, and of special importance here, the commercialization of publicly financed research. So she's the current president of the Licensing Executive Society of South Africa and consistently recognizes a leading patent and intellectual property lawyer. So welcome, Joanne. Saburai has slightly introduced himself. I'll add a few things. As he said, he's the technology transfer specialist at Innovus, which is at Stellenbosch, and responsible for commercializing research outputs across diverse sectors, including biotechnology, life sciences, manufacturing, education, and health. Also experience extending to therapeutics, vaccines, diagnostics. There's a whole list. I sometimes, Sabra, I have to talk about some of these things that you've been licensing. Previously, he headed the seed fund program at the Technology Innovation Agency and oversaw the implementation, management, and pipeline growth of early stage technology funds. So he's held a number of different positions at Stellenbosch and the South Africa Medical Research Council's Innovation Center. I am going to move on because I want to hear from everybody else, but Dr. Mustakim Dagama is head of legal governance, IP, and corporate risk management at Afrigen. He also holds a doctoral degree and was appointed as an extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria. He previously headed the legal department at the legal directorate at the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, where he advised on investment, intellectual property, and trade matters, and contributed to South Africa's intellectual property policy. He's had some really interesting experiences that, again, I would love to talk about. He was previously the South African legal representative to the World Trade Organization, in particularly the TRIPS Council dealing with intellectual property matters, and was instrumental in passing the 2022 WTO TRIPS decision on vaccines in respect of COVID-19. So he joined the Afrigen team in January 2023. So those are your panel. They all have an incredible amount of experience, and so I hope you'll take advantage of that in your questions. We are going to leave time for Q&A towards the end of the session, and if you can, please put your questions in the chat. First, we're going to have a panel discussion, and I'm going to be asking a number of questions in sort of two segments of the different panelists. So my first question is for all of the panelists. Can you briefly explain how you see your organization's role in the pathway from innovation to access? Sabra, you want to start since this is you're my co-moderator?
Sure. Thanks, Julia. So, I mean, universities in general have a particular role to play within when it comes to the R&D, the research and development of health innovations that are cutting edge, that are important in the application, assessment, and validation of health tech and health innovations as well. And while universities have innovation management or technology transfer office, the role for the researchers, especially at universities, is to contribute to the body of knowledge and to assist in the validation, assist in the development, assist in the R&D of figuring out what is possible. Researchers nowadays are focused on improving the efficacy of existing medication, drug development as well of new drugs, the validation of the use thereof as well. So their roles and responsibilities have extended across the sort of technology development value chain. And in my world, it's especially helpful when our researchers are engaging with industry, right? We're engaging with pharma. We understand from pharma what the effective needs are, what they're capable of doing, and where their problems effectively are as well in the manufacturing supply chain, and access effectively to health innovations as well. And that is effectively like the role of our organization, is to be able to assist the various players within the value chain where we can, with the implementation, with the development, and even the assessing the impact of health innovations as well as when they are applied as well, right? to figure out, how best to address social needs. And so from my perspective, that's effectively what I see universities' roles are within the value chain as well. And you can call it a much earlier stage role in the technology development and access pipeline. But it totally depends on who's got what perspective and innovation and expertise to the party. We're also custodians of ensuring that, when R&D is done, it's done in the most effective way, that it complies with certain legislation as well. In South Africa, for example, we've got the Intellectual Property Act that ensures that, there's a custodian and a contact point effectively for the management and commercialization of the intellectual property as well that's created, in order to make sure that the intended impact is reached. So, Julia, that's effectively what I would consider as, our role in the process. Thanks.
Thanks, Sabarai. Joanne, I think you're the next in this chain of discussions.
Sure. So I think what is important to realize is that in South Africa, the majority of my clients are small startups or kind of mid-stage type SME type organizations in the healthcare space, or of course the academic institutes. There are not a lot of big players in South Africa. In fact, I'd maybe say there's barely any big players in South Africa. So really a lot of the types of advice that I would be able to give, or that I'd seek to give to clients, would be to understand their position in the ecosystem. So it's very important to understand, okay, obviously you've got a body of research that you're looking at, but to understand from a medicines or a healthcare production perspective where you sit in the ecosystem, who your competitors are, and who your source providers are, so that you very early on start strategizing where you are going to actually need to start entering into some sort of a negotiation with somebody, so that you don't start the process off with a plan that's actually not going to be commercially viable downstream, or is not going to be affordable downstream. So it's understanding that ecosystem with things like doing patent landscaping searches, identifying who the players are, assisting with negotiations pretty early stage, in terms of access to potential background technologies, or complementary technologies that you're going to have to work on together going forward. A lot of the work that we do is in that space. And then obviously downstream, assisting with the actual transactional side of things. So helping with drafting those licensing provisions, very often from the perspective of somebody who's the licensee, actually, rather than the licensor. But obviously, in the case of a licensor, particularly, it will be the university. Their tech transfer officers in the bigger universities are usually very adept at providing those sorts of agreements. And so it's a matter of casting one's eye over them and giving advice. But some of the smaller universities don't have the expertise, or they don't have the experience. They haven't been doing it for long enough. So in those instances, it's actually assisting with understanding what is the strategy that they're looking for in terms of access. And as Sabri has said, there is a background legislation in South Africa, our Intellectual Property from Publicly Financed Research and Development Act, which puts an onus or an obligation on the institutes to actually protect intellectual property and to commercialize it and provide some societal benefit. So it's to position whoever the entity is that we're advising to be able to actually make that happen practically. So that's, I think, probably the two spaces that we operate in the most.
Thank you. And Mr. Keem, Afrigen plays such an important role in Afrigen, in South Africa, both receiving and licensing out. I'd like to hear your thoughts on your role.
Julie, thanks. Thanks very much. I think for me, this journey really started when I was in Geneva. And, when COVID kind of happened, there was a big question around whether developing countries have the capacity to receive technology, internalize it, and churn out products. And this kind of led me in a direction to start to assess but what does innovation actually mean, and how is that translated in practical terms? And this is maybe something that I'll come back to, but the backdrop to any innovation is the capacity to reduce very complex bits of information into practical processes, to have the relevant financial, technical, and regulatory capacities to implement these. And so as a starting point, for Afrigen at least, I believe that the health innovation ecosystem is important because it is not only limited to receiving technology downstream. I think for Afrigen, we kind of sit in the middle, or what we often call in meetings the missing middle, because there are several points to innovation. And I think to develop platform capabilities, to receive technologies, for example, to optimize them and to industrialize them, actually requires time, it requires resources, and the primary aspect of these resources would be your human capital. I think, as one of the speakers already said, that where you sit in the ecosystem is very important. And I think from Afrigen's perspective, our experience has been invaluable in really assessing how to do this. Now, in practical terms, we believe that our role in converting, let's say, scientific innovation and to really postulate this in a GMP environment is hugely influenced by capacity, by the financial resources to do so. And from that perspective, we believe in the current phase of our development, it's very clear that under normal circumstances, it's not as easy as concluding a license. Licensing is merely the start. There's a whole lot of other things that need to happen to enable the innovation nexus, and a big part of this are the partnerships. And if one just looks at the short history of Afrigen, we've become the mRNA technology hub. And so we were tasked to develop technology, but this technology was not based on a technology transfer in the traditional sense. So we had to collaborate internally with our South African partners to really get to a point where we could postulate and where we could formulate a vaccine. And this was really the basis on which we were able to start to transfer the technology. But in any case, I think what is very important is to understand who your partners are. And our partners are essentially low middle income countries, which means that in order for any innovation, for any transfer to be successful, we have to understand our partners' objectives, capabilities. We also have to understand the regulatory frameworks within which they operate. Not all regulators are at the same level, and so we have to try to work with that. And so basically what we can say is that this requires a partnership mindset. It requires an ability to understand, to troubleshoot, and to adapt the parameters of any project, any product development landscape into a workable solution. I also believe that from innovation to access requires sustainable financing. And where do we find that financing? Well, there is not a deep capital market in South Africa that will finance the type of development that we need. However, through clever partnerships, through public-private enterprises, endeavors, through international grant financing, it is possible to finance various stages of collaboration, and of course on that to really start to build a commercially viable model. So I think at the end of the day, what we are looking at is not just a contractual sequencing, but it is also a collaboration in terms of capacity building, understanding what your partner needs, understanding what you need, understanding the processes that you have to manage. And I think at the end of the day, it also requires that you understand the IP licensing landscape. For us, we had to do a freedom to operate analysis to really see how we execute various projects. And within that context, there would also be matters that go beyond current relationships. So if we wanted to build a sustainable ecosystem, if we wanted to enable local production, what is it that we need to improve about the process? What is it that we need to reduce in terms of supply capacity? Many times you'll talk to your production manager, and the manager will say, well, look here, yes, we can start the project, but we have a 9-month lead time on this piece of equipment, or we have a 6-month lead time on this product. And so this requires a bit of innovation to see which partners within the network can actually supply those products, but it also requires a bit of process engineering. How do we bring down the cost of goods? Because sustainability requires us to produce more cheaply over time, to reduce our reliance to external suppliers, and ultimately, this endeavor is really an industrialization endeavor. Long story short, Julie, these are some of the factors that we have to fold into the innovation pathway, and I'm sure that we will speak a bit more about these. Thank you.
Thank you. You've given us so many things to follow up on. But first, I'm going to go back and ask a couple of questions, sort of beginning at the beginning again with Sabarai. So I think we've heard where some of these need to go and end up. But for you, and when you're representing the university, from a university tech transfer perspective, how do you define a successful deal?
Yeah. Julie, the traditional tech transfer model, okay, it relies heavily on us to be able to demonstrate that we are capable of basically facilitating the financial metrics and basically achieving that as well, right? So what was top of mind traditionally is licensing revenue, upfront fees, equity value at exit, right? Potentially. Those are still important. And I think they are more important for deals that are maybe a bit more mature, right? Or closer to market. Those are metrics effectively that you would apply on a project that, where the validation and the technology development has been done, the market approval has been done, especially also when there's an industry partner involved in working with the university to understand the route to market and, the most appropriate license deal and structure and the commercialization path as well, right? But what we're also seeing more and more is that a successful deal is also one where the technology reaches the end user sustainably, safely, and affordably as well. And to build on what Mustaqim has effectively introduced, right? We know that we won't be able to achieve that if it isn't in partnership with the industry partner that's out there, even the funders who have to fund the development and the reach and the access holistically, right? So we know that we need to think about intellectual property as an enabler to that and not necessarily a barrier to success, okay? And so just to also touch on the South African IPR Act, a lot of the people don't necessarily know that Section 11 of the IPR Act says, you have to prefer licensing, right, as a means and a mechanism to effectively also achieve socioeconomic needs where those are prioritized, okay? So our approach has definitely shifted more from being reactive to proactive, I think. Innovation and innovation management from a university perspective is definitely a lot more proactive and engaging and trying to understand what the different players along the development and commercialization value chain can play and bring to the party, right? And then you license appropriately, effectively, carving out those roles and responsibilities for people down the line. So that at the end of the day, I mean, there's no point in actually licensing a technology and being restrictive around access and enablement, which is going to limit the use and sustainable use of that innovation and technology downstream. So I think that the early IP strategy itself is very important, and understanding what the global footprint is going to be at the disclosure stage, understanding the freedom to operate as soon as possible, and then coming up with those engagement plans, right? And then reassessing them once you actually understand the various parties' roles and responsibility and capability in your discussions as well. So for me, a success means that the various parties that are going to be involved in actually bringing a technology to market has their role well defined, so that we can easily hand over from one party to the other in the technology development path. Thanks, Julie. The question actually for Mustaqim as a follow-on was, as a manufacturer and a tech transfer recipient as well, right? What would you consider the primary operational and financial risks and opportunities that you evaluate when you take on a technology from an innovator and a university as well? And how do you balance financial sustainability considerations with opportunities for supporting the broad and affordable access to a product? I mean, we know that you guys are the mRNA hub, and it's phenomenal that you play that role to facilitate the translation using mRNA technology. But what do you go about basically assessing when you're taking on an innovation or a solution from an innovator?
So, Ray, thanks. That's a very complex question, but I think we really sit at the crossroads of public policy on the one hand, commercial viability, and technical implementation. And so from that perspective, when Afrigen actually looks at an opportunity from as an innovator, for example, we would look at the risk more broadly. And what do I mean by that? We would look at it more broadly than just in terms of IP licensing, because what we understand, or at least what we ask ourselves, is really, it's not necessarily can we get this right to use the technology, but I think for us, not only as an innovator, but also as a manufacturer, we have to look beyond this context, or beyond this event horizon, because for us, the question is, can we scale this up? Can we run it through a very rigorous GMP process? Can we sort out all the regulatory issues? And can we implement a freedom to operate that makes it possible for us to de-risk the operation and to take this to market? And so from that perspective, I think there's a few touch points that I just quickly want to go into. I think the first question for us is really whether the technology is sufficiently mature to be translated into any industrial application, because there's always a lag between it's exciting to sign a licensing agreement, but our experience with many of our collaborators, especially in the global north, has been that there are these traditional expectations. you know that upon signing, you have a certain amount, you have certain milestone payments, and that quickly amounts to millions and millions of rands, even before you've reached any sustainable level. And so from our point of view, we've always tried to push these stage gates or counterpoints to push it further down. But necessarily, I think it's one thing for a technology to work at lab scale. It's a totally different one to be able to take any innovation into a product that goes to market. So I think the technical risk analysis has to be robust, and very important. You have to rely on your technical team to make that assessment. Now, of course, I think for biologics and vaccines, for example, the processes are closely related to the product. And so you have to be able to price all of these things into your process. If there is a shortage of raw materials, this kicks out timelines. If there are glitches in the formulation processes, anything that can influence the production process has to be built into a model where the risk is appropriately identified. And so I speak about partnership, and that's important because you have to have joint committees with all your collaborators to really make those decisions and identify the issues as early as can be. A second point is obviously, when you do take on a process or a product, you have to be able to make a correct regulatory risk assessment. And I think, this comes with a whole lot of different capacities, and what information you actually receive. So from that point of view, once again, very heavy reliance on the technical team is appropriate, and obviously in many licensing negotiations, this is the part that we sometimes forget, because parties may negotiate rights, and royalties and territories, that's always where the main focus is. But in our experience, the real barrier to successful outcomes may actually be whether the receiving party has enough technical or regulatory data to reproduce the products in a compliant manner. And this is why we have stressed with our partners this partnership model, so that we are at the earliest stage possible able to actually troubleshoot this particular aspect. And another point, and I'll come to an end, is really the financial risk. As I said, this is technology transfer is expensive. It is rigorous. It may take a very long time to complete. And so, a license fee is often only a very small part of what the actual cost of this process is, because in many instances, you have a facility that has to be retrofitted. You have to look at your facility readiness. You have to look at, engineering requirements. You have to look at quality issues, stability, and so forth. And this all costs money. It takes time. And I think the challenge for many low-income manufacturers are that these costs are actually incurred way before there is any commercial revenue. And so this creates a really large gap between signing off on something and generating a sustainable income. And I think that's where a lot of us in the developing world actually sits. And this is why access commitments must be matched with almost a realistic development funding. So there has to be predictable demand, procurement planning, and so forth. If there could be upfront procurement and guarantees from governments or international organizations, this always helps the process, because it stabilizes the expectation, and we know how to manage the process from that point onwards. I've already said that IP in the space is contested, it's complex. And obviously, in a scenario where there are overlapping IP claims, you have to be very careful how you do your freedom to operate analysis. And ultimately, if there are conflicts, how do you resolve those conflicts? What are the workarounds? How do you replace a lipid? And so forth. And then it's another rabbit hole that you down. And you're looking at options beyond mRNA, you're looking at synthetics and so forth. So really, I think it's very complex, but it's a necessary aspect of actually understanding the risk that you're taking on, and then of course the market access. You don't want to do a project and in the end it's not feasible because the cost of production are too high. So you also really want to look at how do you de-risk the financial aspect, and I think there's many opportunities that can be exploited, but necessarily I also believe that technology transfer can help to build local capacity. So being able to build local capacity is a dividend from actually planning properly. I think improving supply chain resilience. We've seen the moment COVID arrives, there's a total market closure, and we don't receive what we need to actually continue our production processes. So this is a lesson in itself, that we have to build local and regional supply chain resilience, and actually to reduce our dependence on external suppliers. And this is what Afrigen has been trying to do with local startups. We have several collaborations where we are testing product development to see whether we could actually swap out certain reagents that we're using, and we have validation protocols to do that. So let me stop here, Sabri, but it's a very big question. Sorry for being so long-winded.
No, not at all. Look, I mean, this is exactly why we're hosting the webinars, to make people and perspectives like yourselves accessible to everyone else. I'm going to bring Julie back into the discussion. Julie, you've joined us.
Sorry for my power blink.
No, that's fine.
Yes, and that was actually, Mr. Kim, that was a great introduction back to Joanne, because I've been wondering, as an attorney, and your clients approach you and they say, we really would like our innovation to reach everybody, what we're developing to reach everybody, but we also have commercial objectives and we need to be sustainable or no one's getting the product. How do you advise them about implementing both objectives?
Yeah, thanks, Judy. So it's not a kind of one size fits all type question. It very much depends on the client and where they are and how they position themselves. So, for example, if the client's a university, a publicly financed institute, their mandate is very different potentially from like a business, a company that's making things commercially. So I think the first thing is to kind of look at where they're positioning themselves. But regardless of whether it's a university and of course funding, ability to fund your patent filing process is also going to play into the whole thing. But assuming that I had a client that had lots of money to file patent applications, I would say that it's a good idea to try and go as broadly as you can in terms of your patent filing process, because even if you're not specifically looking to commercially lever your patent monopoly in a particular jurisdiction, it does give you a lot of leverage in terms of who you partner with and also the competitors that are out there. And even when you look at a broader perspective, things like quality assurance and things like that, it's a lot easier to make sure that you have safe products going to market where you've got a monopoly and you're kind of controlling what happens, even if you are making sure that whatever the product is that's being licensed, that the technology is being licensed, that the product itself is being produced at a reasonable sort of amount to the people that are there. Just having the patent monopoly gives you kind of more control over that process. So I do say to clients, try and go as broad as they can, obviously from a patenting perspective as possible. But obviously, if you've got a client that is, I guess more commercially oriented than perhaps a university, but they do want to have broad access, inevitably, you need to have some sort of commercial, I guess, outcome for the company. These aren't altruistic organizations with deep pockets that can just kind of freely make things available everywhere in the world. So very often there's a sort of a bifurcated strategy where you'll have certain territories that are perhaps more first world, able to afford greater quantum for the access to the medicines, and they will then go for a licensing where the access there is on a kind of full commercial basis, and they'll charge more for the license in those territories. The products will be more expensive, etc. And then they will obviously look at certain other territories, like, for example, your low medium income countries, where they say, okay, this is going to have a lower quantum for the license, or maybe there'll be more input from a local licensee that then reduces the costs. They relinquish perhaps a bit more control in terms of the manufacturing process. But obviously, when you have scenarios like that, you need to make sure that in the license agreement there are controls, clauses that you can step in if necessary. Very often, and Sakina has been talking about the sort of partnership model, and I think that becomes very, very important in those kinds of scenarios, because very often it's not just one entity that you're going to be dealing with. There's multiple entities that you're dealing with. It might be funders, additional funders in that area. It might be partners that are providing complementary technologies in that particular area. There may well be regulators that need to be brought in. So the agreements in those sorts of scenarios, it's a good idea to right up front start strategizing what all of these potential things are that you might need to look at and implement clauses or flexibilities or annexes that you can kind of deal with those things going forward, possibly change implementation that needs to be dealt with for those sorts of arrangements would need to be in your agreements as well. So I think those are some of the things that would typically be dealt with. Probably the sort of practical advice is to make sure that you look at your patent filing strategy quite strategically in terms of how you can deal with this, and then look at, depending on where you're going, whether you're looking at non-exclusive versus exclusive licensing, whether there are kind of territorial components to your agreement, and then obviously have the ability downstream to actually review things, your audit responsibilities or your partnership kind of tech transfer type capabilities, to have those in the agreements right up front. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Joanne. No, that was actually also a good introduction to where I think we want to go next, which is really kind of some technical questions about each of your fields. And so I'm going to let Joanne continue, because I think that was a good introduction to a question about what kinds of approaches you consider when you're talking about turning those access objectives into binding contractual commitments. For instance, do you use access plans? What other kinds of specific commitments do you try to put and negotiate into the agreements, and to what extent does that change, of course, on the context of the agreement and the parties?
Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned initially, your IP rights are going to be something that you need to consider. So are you looking at having, a portfolio where you are going to go as broadly as possible, or are you going to try and limit it? How are you going to deal with maybe open access rather than going down the patent route? And is it something which is potentially going to be risky from a kind of a competitive perspective, who maybe hasn't got the quality assurance that you've got in mind? So the first thing is to look at your IP rights and the management and your patenting strategy. And obviously that's going to also depend on who your client is. Is it a university, or is it a corporate, or is it a startup that has minimal resources? So that's the first thing to look at. The second thing to look at is things like your actual licenses. So are you going to have, for access, non-exclusive, sub-licensable provisions? Are you going to have things like royalty-free licenses for particular access scenarios? What kind of step-in rights do you maybe need to have? If your licensee is not able to continue, are you going to be able to step in, replace them with somebody else? So those sorts of clauses you would want to include. You'd also want to maybe look at bringing in partners where you have, for example, someone like the Medicines Patent Pool that you bring on board. They can then help with facilitating access to the licenses with various other entities. Sometimes you don't know exactly who's in the, who the potential licensees are that are in the ecosystem. So something like that can assist with management of that side of things. In addition, it's worthwhile looking right up front, sort of proactively, at what your actual deliverables are going to be. So what are the timelines and target dates that, for the production of your various products, and what happens if those deadlines are not met? What can you do about that in terms of the contract? And so putting in sort of fixed clauses for things like that. And then, of course, if you're dealing with sub-licensees, you want to have flow through. So you want to have the ability in a head license agreement to be able to deal with these sorts of things where you have sub-licensees, because as we've heard, very often this is a partnership. There are multiple players. So you need to be able to deal with that in terms of your kind of sub-license agreements. You can, of course, also look at things like tiered pricing. So as I've said, you might be looking at a first world country. You have a particular pricing option that you're looking at, or you may have an LMIC country, a low medium income country, where you have a reduced pricing, reduced royalties, maybe caps. You would obviously there also want to make sure that you've got audit rights. So you don't want to be in a scenario where you're not aware of exactly and able to gauge exactly what's happening downstream. So you want to have those clauses in place, and you want to have them to be able to flow through if necessary. And then obviously you may have quite complex partnership arrangements where you need to put together steering committees, decision-making processes, etc., in those kinds of agreements. And so obviously these sorts of things would kind of obviously change depending on whether it's early stage or whether it's kind of commercial stage. So typically if it's, early stage, there'd be a lot of emphasis on things like technology transfer, know-how transfer, how to make sure that whoever the producer is in terms of your licensee is actually capable of producing things on an industrialized level, so that you provide a lot of assistance in terms of that. There may well be conditions on things like exclusivity because it's quite early stage, and then down the line as things get more sort of firmed up, perhaps you look at territories where there's exclusivity, etc. Whereas if it's much more kind of late stage, you might be looking at more of the sort of commercial exclusivity in your profitable markets, and then perhaps limiting your kind of LMCs to the non-exclusive type rights or royalty limited rights and that sort of thing. You'd also maybe want to be looking at things like, as I say, partners for local manufacture for some of these countries, and dealing with how you deal with that. So there are obviously going to be some contextual differences as well. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Great, no, thank you, and that's a good way to ask Savaray. So, exclusive versus non-exclusive licenses. That's one potential approach to access-oriented licensing. How do you negotiate commercial exclusivity and all of those different sort of tiered pricing in those very important original licenses that you negotiate?
Yeah, so I mean, it's I think there's a practice basically amongst tech transfer offices, innovation management offices as well, when companies basically come to you and they request having exclusivity for a license. What they don't understand also is that sometimes the exclusivity that they're requesting means that you're effectively losing an opportunity, okay, to engage with other people for access to the same innovation and technology, right? And as a result, there's potentially you're losing out on another opportunity to engage. Sadly, Julie, what I've come across, in the past is that the industry companies who demand exclusivity, right? That once you engage with them and you understand what their strategy is, their route to market, and once they understand exactly what technology development may require in order to, scale up the production and that sort of thing, they come from a perspective of sort of not completely understanding what is required either. And I have experienced where the initial request for exclusivity was kind of like, changed later on once, you sit down with them and then start to unpack exactly what it's going to take and who they would need to partner with in order to bring a technology and innovation to the market as well, right? So, and it's far too often, I think, that companies are very bullish about exclusivity without understanding that, right? Without actually understanding what it's going to take in order to come to the market. I have had instances also where exclusivity was negotiated and put on the table, and where universities have agreed to it, right? Where the companies were just happy to pay the milestones as a means of keeping that technology out of the market. That in hindsight, that's what it turned out to be. But when it was signed, when the agreement was signed, it was actually lauded and celebrated as being a successful licensing deal, right? That there was a farmer or a company interested in a technology, right? So as a tech transfer professional, you really do need to understand and engage. I think that is the first trick, is to understand what exactly is, the company going to produce. How is it going to effectively take it further? And do they really understand what they're going to need in order to take it further as well, right? But coming to Joanne's perspective and input, she's absolutely right. How we would effectively go about to preserve exclusivity. Yes, we can carve out the markets, absolutely, and have some sort of territorial segmentation. If you're lucky to engage with a company who has the value chain sorted out and their partnerships, and they are the preferred partner within a commercial sphere, who are capable of taking a technology ahead from start right through to finish, then it's easier to speak to them about tiered access, right? Or about having the ability to charge a different royalty rate for established markets, as well as and a second one for LMICs, where there's preferential pricing as well when it comes to licensing. There are also field of use restrictions, as what Joanne said. So exclusivity could potentially be given to a particular use case, a premium commercial application, especially if it's a platform technology. But where a platform technology could be used to enable the development, say, for example, of a drug that has a greater burden impact in an LMIC, you could negotiate a different sort of field of use restriction or around that, the use case basically around the technology, right? And then obviously, diligence milestones. Coming back to my initial point where, companies who effectively sit on a license and are just sort of happy to pay minimum royalties, and it does happen, right? It would be very important that when you structure exclusive licenses with these companies, that they do report on sales, on technology development milestones and that sort of thing, so that you know you're working with the right organization in order to enable the access. Thanks, Julie.
No, thanks. That's great. And just a quick thing before I move back to Mr. Keem. In about 10 minutes, we're going to stop talking and try to answer your questions. So I'm just a heads up to be thinking of your questions, and again, put some specific ones in the chat if you have them. But I wanted to follow up then. So we've talked about all these provisions that your lawyer, the original licensor, might try to put in there. But Mr. Keem, I think broad access obligations, or sometimes even the term equitable access, can be viewed as a constraint by developers and future commercial partners. So I wanted to ask you, in your experience at Afrigen, how can access and affordability commitments be structured and explained so that it's an opportunity as an incentive or a way of actually achieving commercial success? How do you negotiate these provisions when you're trying to maximize access, your partner's dubious about access in light of their commercial goals?
Yeah, Julie, that is the million-dollar question, and I think various companies have various means to actually address it. I think from an Afrigen perspective, and you know, within our experience, access does not necessarily need to be seen as a constraint. I think as long as you have a relationship that is mutually geared, I believe that both Sabri and Julie and Joanne have already given a good inputs on this. But I would say that access does not necessarily need to be viewed in a way that it creates some sort of impediment. I think, in my view, access commitments actually work best if the commercial architecture is purposefully built into the relationship up front. And I think both of the previous speakers actually emphasize that. And that really means that access shouldn't be an afterthought, because many times we see that these access provisions are kind of negotiated right at the end, but I think they should be upfront, and they should be linked to incentives, to regulatory support, and so forth, to ensure that you know, the recipient is actually able to benefit. Now, Joanne also mentioned the MPP, the Medicines Patents Pool, and I think that's really instructive, because in many instances, you can use patent pooling and non-exclusive voluntary licensing modalities to improve access in developing countries, because it allows multiple manufacturers to develop and supply medicines, many times with low royalties, or sometimes without royalties, depending on how that deal is actually structured. But it all depends on how you set up your commitments and what opportunities are linked to those commitments. And really, to clarify here, you know, things that I've already mentioned, you know, do you have a funding model in place? Because, as I said, you know, the financial output is already early on at an early stage, and your recoupment is only much later. And I reckon, I guess, from a territorial point of view, how do you define the territory? So for low middle income countries, I believe it's easier to negotiate lower royalty rates. Joanne spoke about, you know, tiered pricing commitments and so forth. I believe that if you build those things into the relationship up front, it actually does allow you to have a better conversation as things go on. For example, in our experience, if a license gives a manufacturer access to a defined, let's say, low middle income territory, and it supports the necessary know-how, it permits sub-licensing or some sort of regional supply dynamic, and it is somehow linked to either public procurement or upfront commitments. I think that access becomes a business case, becomes an enabler, not a stumbling block. And the contrary is also true, and as we've seen with some of our partnerships, where a license imposes a very low price obligation without much volume certainty, very low technical support, and this can become commercially unrealistic. So I think planning and building these things into the relationship is really important. So access obligations should be measurable, and I think as Joanne and both Sabri indicated, we have to avoid the kind of cliches. Many times we look at a contract and we see, oh, this product must be affordable. But it doesn't really say anything, because at the end of the day, it doesn't tell us about the target populations. It doesn't tell us about public sector price bands, for example. These are all things that have to be built in your so-called audit rights, and obviously technology transfer milestones, any delays that have to be accommodated. So I think in the end, this is very important. But to postulate these requirements as obstacles may sometimes mean that you have not properly translated the contractual context into a more practical one. I can say a few things more, but given the fact that we are now moving to Q&A, maybe some of these issues can be raised at that point. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thanks. I will give Joanne a chance to add to that, I guess. If the access commitments are too vague, as we've all seen, they don't actually come into play usually. There's, so you have the desire for specificity to make sure you can enforce the obligations, and you have that pressure of, as you said earlier, some of the partners may not feel that they can make specific obligations at this point in time. They don't know enough. So how do you balance those when you're actually drafting and negotiating the agreement?
Thanks, Julie. I mean, I think so. From an underlying perspective, it's really important to not have this kind of, so and so will do their best or give their best efforts in terms of doing something. If you do get to the point where you're needing to enforce your contract, it becomes extremely difficult for the court to actually enforce something like that, because they're not technically skilled, and they typically won't want to actually interpret what would be considered to be the best efforts. So it's a good idea to, when you're drafting your contracts, to put some sort of standards in terms of what those efforts would mean. So it might be minimum spend, it might be staffing requirements, it might be specific regulatory deadlines or volumes or pricing targets. Those sorts of values should be included into the agreement itself. It's also a good idea to make sure that you include definitions as to what would be considered to be a commercially reasonable step or effort. And then also don't use these kind of vague terms like promptly or, affordable. Rather include specific information in the document, whether it be a specific number of days or whether it be a particular formula in terms of how you work things out. It's also important to make sure that, as you said yourself, sometimes the other side just doesn't know it at the stage of drafting, what's going to be required. So it's worthwhile including some sort of structured escalation and remediation options in the document, so that you can say this is what would be considered to be the best effort. If this doesn't get met, then this is what happens downstream to try and facilitate meeting that, so that there's a kind of good faith delay that is genuine and is dealt with in the agreement, that allows that flexibility without just kind of automatically going into breach. And then the other thing to just also bear in mind is it's a good idea to look at what your governing law is going to be for that particular contract, because sometimes the kind of governing law and what the practical content is will differ from territory to territory. So it's important to maybe also just consider, if you choose a particular territory, what is, if it does come to enforceability for the contract, what are the courts going to look at in terms of that, and make sure that you do choose a governing law that works well. So I think, overall, it's an important consideration to actually put some structured actual values into the agreement, and to allow flexibility by some sort of a fixed procedure in case deadlines aren't met.
Julia, I'm going to add a spanner in the works here, right? Because there were there were instances, right, where we were in situations with businesses, right, working on health innovations that were really important for general access, right? So access was effectively, but we were funded. So it's the funder's restriction and definition of access that various parties need to also consider, right? And because they're effectively giving the funding towards the R&D or the tech dev, or even funding the development of a value chain, right? So what do you guys consider? How do you go about considering? And Julie, this is a question to you as well, because you've got immense experience in this field, right? When it comes to considering funders' requirements to access, right? How do you go about that? And when is their voice and perspective considered, right? In the negotiation of further licensing, as well as, engagements with stakeholders, right?
I will start only because this was leading into the question I was going to ask all three of you. It is really, how do you make sure that early stage access obligations carry through to the sub-licenses and the other partners down the road? And of course, funder obligations are a set of those. So I think Sabra, we'll start with you, even from a university perspective, in those first licenses, to make sure that those attach to the product and not just the IP or other aspects, but that they actually transfer through, and that the reporting obligations enable you to know how they are being enforced. And then another possibility is to actually, for all of the agreements, is to exempt out the access obligations from the definition of confidentiality, because as certainly as the lawyers amongst us might know, I mean, the knee-jerk reaction is to put everything as confidential as possible. But if a downstream partner or funder can't know what an upstream one has already included, then it's very hard for them to carry it through. So just some initial thoughts on that, but I would be interested in your thoughts about how do you make sure that those early stage obligations make it through to the partner that actually is going to make and sell that product.
So look, I mean, I can draw from some experience when we were funded by a multinational organization, right, where they stipulated that the product needed to have, there were definite global access requirements when it linked to their funding. But we, in one instance, for a TB diagnostic, we were lucky when engaging with a licensee, that licensee had the same obligation to the same funder, right? And by concluding the agreement with that licensee, we actually, both of us met a condition within our funding from the same license funder that I think worked really, really well, okay? And that actually set the project up and the tech transfer up really nicely, because the funder was very interested in facilitating and then funding the tech transfer as well. So the funder had funded the platform in the company and the R&D and clinical trial evaluation at the university. And then they were prepared to come on board to facilitate the funding of the tech transfer as well. In another project, it was really difficult because the global funder funded the R&D, the tech dev, the validation, but then a local South African funder came on board and then said, well, we want all that. We want to be able to control, access and that sort of thing. And there was a conflict. And how we resolved that was to actually get both funders in the room and speak to the conflict directly and said, listen, at the end of the meeting, we need to be able to agree on a way forward, because both of you want the tech transfer and access to happen, the commercialization to happen. How do we then go about it? And both had to escalate it to their committees, get certain approvals when it came to the commercialization and the relaxation of certain expectations when it came to their own policies. And it was a real situation. And I think this is the thing, is that you have to approach it openly to say, without, and the expectation also with regard to the NDA and the confidentiality was, please share the agreement with us. And we were not able to. We took out the clause, copied and pasted it and said, this is the clause that we're referring to, but you're just going to have to trust us, being the recipient of both downstream and upstream sources of funding. So it was a practical consideration, but you need to get people in the room to discuss it openly and constructively, and also to coordinate it, to say, guys, without you, both of you buying in, we won't be able to facilitate the tech transfer and the commercialization.
Thanks. I'm realizing we are really running out of time. Mr. King might need to add something briefly here, but after that, I can't see the questions, so I'm hoping somebody is looking in the chat. Can you
I'll
see
be able
them?
to help you with that. Yes, I'll be able to help you with that.
All right, Mr. King, you want to add something briefly, and then we'll try to address some questions.
Yes, Julia, I think maybe just one or 2 points. I feel you, Sabri, because sometimes when you are dealing with funders, you have interesting scenarios. I think we had a recent situation where we had a project that was already running for at least 2 years, and the funder got funding from another organization, and that organization required the funder to enforce a policy that would make redundant our reliance on the BOLA exemption. We then had to swap out what we were using, which was a lipid, with something else. And the cost related to this, the change control, everything makes it very challenging to firstly continue. Well, we will continue with the project, but it just shows you how much power a funder could have over your projects. But maybe a last point, in terms of of ensuring that you maintain your access orientation, I believe that access moves with the technology. And every time you have a sub-license, you must stipulate for this. And I think, at the end of the day, you must also, under certain circumstances, underscore step-in rights. You must know what's happening in the process. You must negotiate the type of audit rights that enable you to know firsthand how this happens. So ultimately, I believe that if you do not contractually and visibly, demonstrably put your rights on the table, they will be ignored conveniently. And at the end of the day, it is very difficult to fight for something once the horse is bolted. So put on the harness, and try and fasten it before you mount the horse, because in the end, as you ride that horse, you may fall down to your own detriment. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am so going to use that picture. I was thinking that's great. All right, questions. I guess I see there's one raised hand.
Heel, if I've got your name correctly, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question.
Hello, everyone. This is Mehal Tadasa from the Armor Cancer Research Institute in Ethiopia. We have the Artificial Intelligence and Digital Health Innovation Lab, and our institute specializes in biomedical and clinical research and innovation ecosystem, working in Ethiopia and beyond. We are recipients for multiple EDCP funds, out of which we are supposed to provide some of the biomedical products. So my question is around if there is a continental framework where we can leverage our products, whether they are advanced tech solutions, software as medical devices, or diagnostics, where we can spin off from the just pilot stage prototypes to large scale or large volume consumption, and then leverage on the commercial value of our products in a continental platform. And thank you so much for all of you guys who have really produced this virtual meeting, and I say it's a productive training as well. And I'm also looking forward to further engagement, how we can materialize. I have been to actually University of Stellenbosch back in 2018. Actually, that was to the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare inside the University of Stellenbosch. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. I'm not too sure who's going to give so from what I understand, you're asking for a continental framework that effectively will assist us, right?
Yes, that is exactly where many innovations from Africa, including Ethiopia, are just lagging behind. I'm sure you might have heard this word pilotages. Most of innovations of scientific discovery are coming from proof of concept to prototype, then from prototype to just a small scale piloting. And you don't see them moving beyond a pilot stage due to various contextual factors. And, but the enabling ecosystem is very narrow unless you have international collaborator. As in, for instance, EDCTP is playing a huge role in terms of, advancing this. But I wanted to learn, and also I am ready to contribute if there is any emerging continental framework that we could put together. We can also onboard Africa CDC and other key players in the continent that can help enable to spin off products that are piloted and validated and tested in a certain clinical context and found to be adding value to the patient, cost effective and affordable. How we can spin off this from a pilot stage to large scale commercialization, and what is the commercial route actually? Like the purchasing power of our people is obviously known, and actually, is it the government? business, industry, what is going to
I think,
purchase our product? Yeah, thank you.
I think so. So there are a couple of, I would say, marketplaces and areas that we could potentially advertise, market, and that sort of thing. And I can share that with you. I've got your email address. Also, if anyone else in the attendance list in the room can also share their ideas around that, and then I think what we could do is maybe set up a bit of a chat forum around sharing those innovative ideas with one another, so that you never know who could be interested in whose innovation and technology, and collaborate also at the end of the day as well. Thanks so much for your email address. I want to acknowledge Bruce.
I'll send you my email, and
Thanks.
we can set up a separate meeting of
Yeah,
potential products we have that we have validated and tested, and we are ready for commercialization.
And if anyone else wants to join that meeting, okay, just email me, and then we'll be able to set that up afterwards. I want to acknowledge Bruce's questions and other people's questions, but Bruce, would you be able to unmute yourself and then ask your question very briefly?
Can you all hear me? Thank you for the opportunity. I guess you might have already seen, I wanted to be very, very brief.
Yes.
It is really, the question is really directed to you, Sabri, as well as Johan. It is about university spin-outs and local biotechs that are often forced, to trade between high volume and low margin public health models.
Yeah.
And of course, the challenge is that, from your perspective, if local innovation is heavily subsidized by public money, is it time to champion a dual licensing framework where private, profit explicitly cross-subsidized public sector access? And if so, what can how can we prevent the private partner from structurally neglecting this public supply chain? I don't know whether you get my point.
Yeah.
This is, for example, if you are developing, for example, I have a project where we are using public funds to develop a vaccine, all right? And of course, when we do that, we using the state or the government prefers us that we use facilities such as the ARC, OBP, for example, but they don't have the capacity. So now we have to use private sector. And if you start involving the private sector, obviously the private sector is interested in making more money out of the engagement. But the government want us to use public facilities. So you've got this balance, these challenges is that on one hand, money is being used by government, they want to get lesser prices. But if private sector get involved, then they want more. So how do you balance that? I hope I don't want to keep the context to that question that I was bringing.
Thanks, Bruce. Joanne, do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, as you say, a kind of a dual framework for something like this really would work well. And a lot of the time it's about educating the private entities that you're working with around the constraints that you're operating in within the IPR Act, and saying, look, we do have these constraints, but we can look at a dual model with you. And then obviously negotiating that. And then obviously on the other side, one also has to get the agreement from NIPMO. And I think they're overwhelmingly, I think we're quite lucky that as long as you can provide a justifiable reason for you doing something in a particular way, typically the team at NIPMO is quite kind of reasonable in terms of granting what you need to do. So I think you need to couple those two things together. It's around engaging with NIPMO, preferably earlier on, and explaining your requirements and why you're doing something in a particular way. And then obviously on the private entity side of things, educating them in terms of why you need to do something in a particular way, and having these kind of dual frameworks where you can say to them, look, in these particular perhaps countries or in these particular populations or in this particular field of use, you'll be able to go for the premium, but in other in other territories or in other fields of use or populations, this is what you're looking at. And as again, doing it early on so that you can actually negotiate something that works for all of you.
Yeah. Well, I've got John Sifani's question here. He says, my question is centered around finding good practice for sharing profits from spin-off company co-financed with government and private sector. He says, we are in a process of developing our startup and profit sharing policy, hence need guidance. First of all, a spin out that's generating profit, okay, well done. If you've done that and you've managed to commercialize your technology and you're effectively reaching out and making sure that a health innovation is in the market, then good on you, well done. First box ticked, right? Sharing profits, I think that is actually a commercial decision that your board or your governing organization of the company, okay, would need to understand around a model, okay? And I think you would need to understand, from what I understand, you've been funded through government and private sector funding. Here again, your funders actually have a key voice when it comes to your sustainability as a business, right? And then also to be able to share profits as well. So personally, I think from my perspective, okay, if I were to license a technology to you and you're successfully commercializing it in the market, okay, I'd be interested in your own sustainability so that you are able to grow the market, grow access, ensure that the innovation reaches the target market, okay? And then once you've made enough profits and you're paying yourselves and your funders dividends and everybody's happy, right? I mean, I'd first want you to focus on your own sustainability before focusing on, you know, being able to spend those dividends and shared profits with others. If you're a social business or a business focused and built on sort of like a social values, social impact values, then there are various ways that you can achieve that by partnering with others in the value chain to be able to provide value and to share the profits through those partnerships, right? So that's something I would basically want you to consider.
So I just have one thing to add to what Sabri said is, obviously, if you've got government funding, there's also going to be an element of profit sharing that needs to go back to the institute and the inventors.
Yeah.
So it's and that's stipulated in terms of legislation. So it's important to also just take that into consideration when you calculating what you've got and divvying it up.
Yeah. Thanks, Joanne. We are heading towards the end of our time, Julie. I'm looking to you about how we're going to conclude.
Yes. Yes. First of all, thank you, especially for those of you that have continued over time and still have questions. I think if you can send us your email addresses, we will try to address the questions. Sabri, that somebody said also, we, I guess, have not yet put the link to the previous webinar in the chat, so we need to share that.
We will.
And we would love to have your ideas if you do want a future conversation, a webinar, or some kind of gathering. Do let us know what you would like addressed and how you felt this one went, other than running over time. But I'm going to let Sabri answer whether he wants to answer one more question or not. But otherwise, we will say thank you again for your enthusiastic participation. And I'm going to thank my fellow panelists because I was fascinated with many of the things you said, and I would love to have a future discussion on these. So much appreciated. Sabri, I'll let you close out and let us know what is the final burning question you want to answer.
Absolutely. So Julie, thanks so much. Thanks so much to GHIAA as well for coming on board to, you know, put the global access to health innovation, put the topic basically on our radar as well. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you. because I think it's something that we need to discuss in these forums more often. And Julie, maybe we should think about a follow-up webinar, a follow-up panel discussion as well, right? And I also want to thank Dr. De Gama and Van Hamelen, because your perspectives are very valuable, right? And yeah, creating a platform where we give you a voice to share your perspectives, I think is just going to be needed as well, because we're often in our own environments thinking about like ways to, you know, solve our problems and taking it forward as well. I think what I've learned is, you know, open communication and being honest around, you know, what we are capable of doing and who's playing what role, and, you know, agreeing on an endpoint and a path, but then also having the flexibility to discuss and change as, you know, the pawpaw hits the fan often nowadays. So it's all about being able to deal with risk and change, even in how we contract with one another and how our projects also evolve, right? So, colleagues, I'm going to close the session. You have our email addresses where you can email us with questions, suggestions, right, on follow-ups. And definitely, if you're interested in the sort of like discussion around a global forum or framework to sharing innovations, technologies, you know, we're totally open to that as well. So feel free to email us. Thanks so much to everybody for spending your time. We appreciate it. And I just want to say thank you again and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you and
Thank
goodbye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.